Beneath the Badge and Robe, Part 1. It was nearly dark when Officer James Miller spotted the man walking briskly down Oakwood Lane. James had been on the police force in Littlehampton for 20 years, and he prided himself on knowing who belonged where. The small English coastal town rarely saw serious crime, but tonight there had been a report of a break-in at one of the fancy houses near the beach. The man was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up despite the mild evening. He was tall with dark skin, moving quickly and looking down at the pavement. James felt his heart rate quicken as years of ingrained suspicion took over his thinking. "Police! Stop right there!" James shouted, one hand reaching for his radio while the other moved to his weapon. The man stopped immediately but didn't turn around. "Hands where I can see them. Turn around slowly," James ordered, his voice firm and practiced. The man raised his hands carefully and turned to face James. There was something in the man's eyes that caught James off guard. Not fear or guilt, but a calm, steady gaze that seemed to look right through him. Despite having an officer confronting him, the man held himself with remarkable dignity. "Good evening, officer," the man said in a deep, educated voice. "Is there a problem?" James felt his suspicion deepen. Something didn't fit. The voice was too confident, too proper for what James had expected. "There's been a break-in reported nearby." "What are you doing in this area at this hour?" James asked, still keeping a safe distance. "I'm walking home," the man replied simply. "I live at number 43 just around the corner. I've been visiting my daughter who recently moved to town." James studied the man's face more carefully. There was something familiar about him, but he couldn't quite place it. "I'll need to see some identification, sir," James said. The "sir" slipping out almost automatically in response to the man's dignified manner. "Of course, my identification is in my inside pocket. May I reach for it?" James nodded, watching carefully as the man slowly reached inside his jacket and pulled out a wallet. He handed it to James, who flipped it open while keeping an eye on the man. What James saw made his stomach drop. The ID card inside featured the emblem of the British Supreme Court. The photo matched the face before him, and the name read, Justice David Thompson, Chief Justice. James nearly stumbled backward. He was confronting the first black Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a man whose face he had seen in newspapers and whose landmark decisions were studied by every officer during legal training. "Justice Thompson," James said, his voice suddenly hoarse. I apologize for stopping you like this." Justice Thompson took his wallet back and put it away carefully. "May I ask, Officer Miller," he said, reading James's name badge, "what exactly made you stop me this evening?" James felt heat rising to his face. The truth hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and accusing. "There was a report of a break-in," James said weakly. "And did the report mention the suspect was a black man in his 60s wearing a hoodie?" Justice Thompson asked, his voice level but with an edge of challenge. James couldn't meet his eyes. They both knew the answer. "No, Your Honor," James admitted. "Would you have stopped me if I had been white?" The question hit James like a physical blow. He wanted to defend himself, to say of course he would have, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. He had acted on instinct, an instinct shaped by years of biases he had never properly examined. "I don't know," James finally said, the most honest answer he could give. Justice Thompson nodded slowly. "At least that's an honest answer." He looked at James for a long moment. "Good night, Officer Miller." As Justice Thompson walked away, James stood rooted to the spot, his worldview shifting uncomfortably beneath his feet. The end. Beneath the Badge and Robe, Part 2. James Miller couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Justice Thompson's face, calm and dignified, despite having been treated like a criminal. The question kept echoing in his mind. Would you have stopped me if I had been white? 3 days passed, and James went through his duties like a man sleepwalking. His sergeant noticed and asked if he was feeling unwell, but James couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened. The Chief Justice hadn't filed a complaint. No one at the station knew about his terrible mistake. On the 4th day, James made a decision. He wrote a formal letter requesting a meeting with Justice Thompson, explaining that he wished to apologize properly. He didn't expect a response, but 2 days later his phone rang. "Officer Miller, this is David Thompson's assistant. The Chief Justice can see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock if that suits you." James felt his mouth go dry. Yes, that would be fine, thank you." The Supreme Court building in London was grand and imposing. James felt small as he climbed the stone steps in his best suit, the one he usually wore only for weddings and funerals. A young woman met him at the entrance and led him through long corridors to a heavy wooden door. "Justice Thompson will see you now," she said, opening the door. The office was surprisingly simple, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk covered in neat stacks of papers. Justice Thompson stood as James entered, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Officer Miller," he said with a nod. "Please sit down." James remained standing. "Your Honor, I want to thank you for seeing me. I came to apologize. What I did was wrong." "Yes, it was," Thompson agreed simply. He sat down and motioned again for James to do the same. This time, James obeyed. "Tell me, Officer Miller, have you thought about our encounter?" James nodded. "I haven't thought about much else." "And what conclusions have you reached?" James took a deep breath. "That I acted on prejudice, not proper policing. I saw a black man in a nice neighborhood and immediately assumed you didn't belong there." Justice Thompson watched him carefully. "That's a start. Why do you think you made that assumption?" The question caught James off guard. He had expected anger or perhaps cold dismissal, not this calm inquiry. I don't know," he admitted. "I've been a police officer for 20 years. You start to see patterns, or at least you think you do." "Patterns," Thompson repeated. "Yes, the human mind loves patterns. But sometimes what we think are patterns are really just reflections of our own fears and biases." James nodded slowly. "You know," Thompson continued, "when I was appointed to the Supreme Court, many people questioned whether I belonged there too. They didn't say it was because of my skin color. They cited my background, my education, my previous rulings, but the underlying message was the same. You don't belong in this neighborhood." For the first time, James saw a flicker of emotion cross the judge's face, a brief shadow of old pain. "How did you handle that?" James asked. Thompson smiled slightly.
"I showed up every day and did my job to the best of my ability."
"Eventually, most people stopped questioning my right to be there." He leaned forward. "But Officer Miller, I was able to prove myself because someone opened the door and let me in. Many others never get that chance because the door stays firmly closed or because they're stopped before they even reach it." James felt the weight of those words settle on him. "I've been part of the problem," he said quietly. "Yes," Thompson agreed. "The question now is, what will you do about it?" James looked up, meeting the judge's gaze directly for the first time. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I want to change. I need to change." Thompson nodded. "That's a good place to start." The end. Beneath the Badge and Robe, Part 3, A Week. After his meeting with Justice Thompson, James sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside him. He had been thinking about the judge's question. What will you do about it? The answer had come to him that morning while driving to work, passing young officers fresh from training. James picked up his phone and called his sergeant. "Tom? It's James Miller. I was wondering if I could speak to you about the new training program for cadets." 2 days later, James stood nervously in front of Sergeant Tom Barrett and Chief Inspector William Hughes in the small meeting room at Littlehampton Police Station. "So, Officer Miller," the Chief Inspector said, looking over his glasses, "you want to develop a new training module about bias in policing? What brought this on?" James took a deep breath. "I made a mistake, sir. A serious one." He told them about his encounter with Justice Thompson, not hiding any details or trying to excuse his actions. When he finished, the room was quiet. "Why hasn't this come across my desk already?" Hughes asked finally. The Chief Justice could have had your badge. He didn't file a complaint, sir, James replied. I think he wanted to give me a chance to learn from it instead. The Chief Inspector leaned back in his chair, studying James. And have you learned from it? I'm trying to, sir. That's why I want to speak to the new officers. I want to tell them about my mistake, so maybe they won't make the same one. Hughes and Barrett exchanged a look. It takes guts to admit something. Like this, James, Barrett said. But one training session isn't going to fix the problem. I know that, James agreed. It's just a start. The Chief Inspector tapped his fingers on the table, thinking, if we do this, we do it properly. Not just a one-off talk, but a proper program. And not just for new recruits, for everyone, including me. James blinked in surprise. You'd support that, sir? This isn't just your problem, Miller, it's a police problem. Hughes stood up. Draft a proposal, and see if your judge friend would be willing to help. Having the Chief Justice involved would certainly get attention. He's not exactly my friend, sir. Well, maybe he should be, Hughes replied. We could use more friends in high places who are willing to work with us instead of against us. That evening, James wrote a careful email to Justice Thompson, explaining the meeting and asking if he might consider being part of a police training program. He didn't expect a quick reply. The Chief Justice must receive hundreds of emails daily. But the next morning his phone rang. Officer Miller, David Thompson here. James nearly dropped his toast. Your Honor, thank you for calling. Your email was interesting, Thompson said. I've been thinking along similar lines myself. Perhaps we could discuss it over lunch. 2 weeks later, James found himself sitting in a small restaurant with Justice Thompson, surrounded by papers and notes. What had begun as a simple training module was growing into something much bigger. A community oversight board, Thompson was saying, with representation from the police, the judiciary, and local citizens. Not just to handle complaints, but to actively work on building trust and understanding. James nodded, making another note. And regular community meetings where officers can hear directly from people about their experiences and concerns. Exactly. Thompson smiled. You know, Officer Miller, when I agreed to meet you that first time, I didn't expect much. Perhaps a quick apology and a promise to do better. I didn't expect much either, James admitted. Certainly not this. Sometimes good things come from unlikely beginnings, Thompson said. You made a mistake, but you're willing to learn from it. That's rare. James looked down at his notes, feeling a warmth that wasn't just embarrassment. I still have a lot to learn. We all do, Thompson replied. That's the point. The end. Beneath the Badge and Robe, Part 4. 3 months after their first lunch meeting, James and Justice Thompson stood together at the front of the Littlehampton Police Station's main meeting room. The space was packed with officers from all ranks. Chief Inspector Hughes sat in the front row, his face serious as he looked around at his team. Thank you all for coming today, James began, his voice steadier than he felt. As some of you know, a few months ago I made a serious mistake while on duty. I stopped and questioned a man simply because he was black and walking in an upscale neighborhood. A murmur ran through the room. James took a deep breath and continued. That man was Chief Justice David Thompson, who has kindly agreed to join us today. All eyes turned to Thompson, who nodded politely. I'm not here to shame Officer Miller, Thompson said. In fact, I admire his courage in turning a mistake into an opportunity for change. We've spent the last few months developing what we're calling the Littlehampton Justice Initiative. James stepped forward again. The initiative has 3 main parts. First, training for all officers about recognizing and addressing bias. Second, regular community meetings where local people can speak directly with police. And third, a community oversight board with members from the police, the courts, and the public. He looked around the room, seeing a mix of interest, skepticism, and discomfort on his colleagues' faces. I know what some of you are thinking, James said. You're thinking you're not biased. You're thinking you treat everyone the same. I thought that too. But that night with Justice Thompson showed me I was wrong. At the back of the room, Constable Robert Parker crossed his arms. So we're all supposed to admit we're racist now? He called out. The room went quiet. Chief Inspector Hughes started to rise, but Thompson held up a hand. "That's a fair question," Thompson said. "No one is asking you to label yourself as racist. What we're asking is that you consider the possibility that all of us, myself included, carry unconscious biases that affect our actions and decisions." "I don't see color," Parker insisted. "I treat everyone exactly the same." "May I ask you something, Constable?" Thompson said. "When you see a young man walking down the street at night, do you assess the level of threat he might pose?" "Of course," Parker replied. "That's just good policing." "And what factors go into that assessment?" Parker shifted uncomfortably. "Behavior, body language, context. Anything else?" Thompson pressed gently. Parker didn't answer. "The truth is," Thompson continued, "our brains are constantly making quick judgments based on appearance, including skin color. We can't help it, it's how our brains process information. The problem comes when we don't recognize those snap judgments for what they are and don't question them." From the middle of the room, Sergeant Barrett spoke up. "So what are we supposed to do? Second guess every decision we make?" "No," James answered. "But we can learn to pause, to ask ourselves, would I be responding the same way if this person looked different? Is my reaction based on actual behavior or on assumptions?" That pause, Thompson added, could be the difference between a fair interaction and an unjust one. Sometimes it could even be the difference between life and death. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a thoughtful silence. After the meeting, as officers filed out, some stopped to ask questions or share their own experiences. A few avoided eye contact entirely. James had expected resistance, but he was encouraged by how many seemed genuinely interested. "Good start," Chief Inspector Hughes said, joining James and Thompson. "But you know this won't be easy, right? Change never is." Thompson smiled slightly. "The most important things rarely are." The end. Beneath the Badge and Robe, Part 5, 1. Year had passed since the first meeting of the Littlehampton Justice Initiative. On a bright spring morning, James Miller stood at the podium in the town hall, looking out at the crowd of police officers, local residents, and reporters. Beside him sat Justice Thompson, Chief Inspector Hughes, and Mary Baker, the newly elected head of the Community Oversight Board. "When we started this journey," James began, "I wasn't sure where it would lead. I only knew that I had made a mistake that opened my eyes to something important. The past year had been challenging. Some officers had resisted the changes, and a few had even left the force. There had been heated discussions at community meetings with painful stories shared by local residents about their experiences with police. But slowly, things had begun to change. Today, I'm proud to share our first-year results," James continued. "Complaints against officers are down by 30%. Community satisfaction with police response has improved. And most importantly, our officers report feeling better equipped to serve all members of our community fairly." He glanced at Constable Parker, who sat in the third row. Parker had been one of the strongest critics of the initiative at first. But 6 months in, after a training session where he had heard directly from community members about their experiences, something had shifted for him. "I'd like to invite Constable Robert Parker to share his thoughts," James said. Parker looked surprised but made his way to the podium. He cleared his throat nervously. "A year ago, I thought this whole thing was a waste of time," he admitted. "I didn't think I had any biases to address, but then I started really listening to people's stories and examining my own reactions." Parker paused, collecting his thoughts. "There was this call I went on, a reported break-in at a shop. When I arrived, there were 2 men there, the shop owner, who was white, and his friend, who was black. Without even thinking about it, I immediately addressed the white man as Sir and asked if he was the owner. The look on both their faces." Parker shook his head. "It was a small thing, maybe, but it showed me that I was making assumptions I wasn't even aware of." When Parker finished speaking, Mary Baker took the podium. "The Littlehampton Initiative isn't perfect," she said. "We still have a long way to go. But what makes it special is that it's not about blame or shame. It's about growth and understanding." After the formal presentations, people mingled over tea and biscuits. James found himself standing with Justice Thompson near the windows. You've accomplished a great deal, Thompson said. We have, James agreed, though sometimes I wonder if it would have happened at all if I hadn't stopped you that night. Thompson smiled. Perhaps not in this way. But change was coming one way, or another. The question was always whether it would come through conflict or cooperation. Across the room, James saw a young black officer talking animatedly with Chief Inspector Hughes. She was part of the new recruitment class, the most diverse in the station's history. You know, James said, when we first met, I could only see what made us different. Now I see what we have in common. And what's that? Thompson asked. We both believe in justice, James replied. Real justice. Not just the kind that comes from laws and badges, but the kind that comes from seeing each person's full humanity. Thompson nodded. That's the only kind that matters in the end. As the sun streamed through the windows of the town hall, James Miller felt something he hadn't expected when this all began. Hope. Not that they would solve every problem or heal every wound, but that they were finally moving in the right direction, step by step, together. The end.